All right, let's start going into the runtime. I want to start off with ASP.NET Core, and this really is it's one of the big dogs. It's one of the big dogs inside .NET. It can run so many things. You got this, and then you got MAUI, and then you got the desktop variants of WinForms and WPF. But ASP.NET Core, it came from active server pages in the late 90s. That's what ASP stands for. And even before active server pages came around, when the IIS server version 1 or 2 came with the code nugget, the less than %, and then active server pages kind of inherited the less than % sign. And now, we're using less and less of that tag, but it has a long heritage going all the way back. However, within it, you can write these UI-based web applications. You can write web services that have no HTML in them whatsoever. You have unified middleware, these pipelines of logic that can direct a URL to go to a certain place. You can mix MVC with Blazor, with Razor Pages, with web API controllers for HTTP APIs. And then there's all these extensions that work across the board everywhere. Dependency injections baked in. The configuration has all kinds of options, whether you want to get your config from an app settings.json file or get your config from environment variables. It's your choice. And then it's still called ASP.NET Core, but one thing that this part of .NET does super, super well is just run little tiny worker services. If you're going to add a microservice or 2 or several to a particular system, then you're just going to create a worker service, which is going to run as an ASP.NET Core process. Doesn't have anything to do with HTML, doesn't have anything to do with web services. Maybe all it does is sit there and listen to an Azure Service Bus queue, and whenever a message comes in, it does something. Or maybe it just sits there and listens for a SignalR message to come in, and then it calls somebody else and does something. Or maybe it does expose, an HTTP API. But either way, worker services just sit there and do something and can be triggered by all kinds of interesting things that happen. But from an architectural perspective, the big thing that I want to convey is that it's optimized for Linux. Okay, it works great on Windows, but going forward, so much of this is being intentionally designed and tested for Linux. And I'll talk about that more when we get to Azure Container Apps. I don't want to scare anybody away that is an entire Windows ecosystem, because so am I. I mean, I'm not a Mac guy. I'm not an Apple guy. I don't have a Linux desktop. I have a Linux VM, and I don't proactively run Linux VMs historically. My entire career is Windows desktop, Windows server, and in Azure, of course, all of app service is all Windows compute. Now you can run some Linux and app service, but if we're running .NET applications, Windows has kind of been our go-to. And ASP.NET Core and all these things run absolutely perfectly on Azure App Service. They do, and you know what? 80%. It's a super high number of all the custom applications in Azure are on App Service. That's the big dog, and most of that, for Microsoft Shop.NET developers is Windows. But with Azure Container Apps, again, which we'll talk about more, so much is being optimized for Linux. Kubernetes does not work on Windows. Kubernetes is a Linux framework for containers, and Azure Container Apps runs on top of Kubernetes. So by definition, all the stuff you see with Azure Container Apps, translating that in your head to Linux runtime. But if you're running on .NET 7 and you don't have any kind of historical Windows dependencies, then you're natively platform agnostic anyway. You don't care if it runs on Windows and Linux. You just don't care. Okay. So let's keep going. One of the huge things with .NET 7 to be aware of is performance continued to increase. .NET 7 overtook Go in this past round for some of the benchmarks. but .NET 7 is the top dog right now when it comes to web service requests per second. So that should make you feel really good from investing in this and training your team more on this, because 10 years ago there was a lot of talk about Node.js, and it was gaining ground. And from a performance perspective, .NET was kind of middle of the road, right in line. But now .NET 7 from a performance perspective absolutely blows everybody away. So that's really encouraging. And JSON, working with JSON, that also has huge improvement over .NET 6, which is already fast. So .NET 7, king of the hill when it comes to web performance. So that's really encouraging. All right. I'm not going to go into all these features of ASP.NET Core. Here's a smattering of some of the new things that came out. Rate limiting is really interesting because whether it's an intentional denial of service attack or whether one application just goes haywire, and let's say we don't want to scale a particular web application up to infinity. We just want to let it run on 1 or 2 CPUs and say, whatever it can do in that capacity, it can do. Well, rate limiting is our friend from that. Also, output caching is going to limit the CPU usage. Route grouping, for those of you who do tons of web services, that's going to be your friend. And then on the Blazor side, custom elements is going to be huge for you. And the data binding, there's now first-class events for when someone types in a Blazor text box, and you can run your C# code as a response to someone typing a character in. So that's less interop with JavaScript having to do client-side events in the browser for those Blazor applications. And I'm gonna let you do your own research. Go back to the .NET Conf sessions to see more about this. But I want to just stick to the high level, the really big ones, in my opinion, that make a difference architecturally for you. I'll highlight the Blazor, some of the Blazor things. Quick Grid is really interesting because it's that virtualized infinity-sized grid that can just stream things instead of having to go to a Radson control or Infogistix or any of the component vendors. There's going to be one of them kind of built in for Microsoft that can do data virtualization. I talked about the bind enhancement. This is kind of what it looks like. After someone changes a character, you can run some code. After someone sets a value, you can run some code in a C# method. Those are interesting. And then you got navigation locking to make sure that no one navigates away from your application unintentionally without some sort of warning. So you have a hook there. You can run some code when someone's about to navigate away, and then you can block that navigation if you so choose. We talked about custom elements, loading progress, which you'll see in the demo app that I show you real quick, and then of course some performance. So lots of good things I'm not going to touch on. I just wanted to highlight those. On the MAUI side, they've been doing a lot of work with MAUI. If you are looking for the write once, run anywhere, from Android to iOS to Windows desktop to Mac desktop to web in Blazor WebAssembly, then .NET MAUI is going to be really interesting for you. This round was tweaks. Okay. .NET 7 round for MAUI was not anything groundbreaking. It was they're filling in the gaps. They released it, they went GA. It's not yet that canonical version 3. They're still working on making it a complete package. They're still working on tooling. The iPhone pairing for the Apple restriction that you have to compile on an Apple device in order to actually run it for iPhone. That's a little bit clunky still, but lots of great work. And if you need to target those environments, it is already good enough for you to do that without doing a native iPhone app and then a native Android app. And if you have Xamarin, if you've been doing Xamarin already in the past, then this is a straight upgrade improvement for you over Xamarin Forms. But the .NET 7 round for MAUI was incremental improvements. And you can see devblogs.microsoft.com/.net/.net MAUI .NET 7 for all those announcements.